In this video, we'll take a look at classes intended to be used for forms and form fields. So you'll recall when we talked about Reboot that it will reset all of the styling and give an even baseline that they can then build on with their own style. So Bootstrap, first of all, baselines your forms using Reboot, and then it provides opt-in classes that you can use to style up your forms to make them look like that special Bootstrap style that we've all become accustomed to. And so here you can see in the HTML5 elements bootstrap.html that we introduced a couple of lessons ago, I've got just examples of the various input controls and how they're used. And we'll use this as inspiration. So I'll copy parts of this and use it in our hands-on portion of this video here in just a moment. And just as a reminder, here's what the form fields will look like by default, at least in Chrome. Some of them have, your complete black border, but there's no rounded corners. It's very cut and dry, not a lot of style. They do have, at least in Chrome, you've got interesting input controls like spinners, drop-down calendars, and things of that nature, which are pretty neat. For the most part, though, it's pretty what I would call vanilla. And so we can dramatically improve the look and the feel of our forms by introducing them to Bootstrap, some of the Bootstrap classes, in fact. So let's go ahead and add a new HTML page called Form Classes. All right, we've got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to have to move through this quickly enough. But as always, the main source of inspiration for you should be the support site for Bootstrap itself. I'm going to make a couple of rows, and then I can modify them later. But I think I'm going to need quite a few, so we'll just start there and move on from there. And the first thing I'd like to do is just go and very simply grab this simple example of a label and an input control as a point of reference, and we're not going to style it up at all. And then what I want to do is kind of come at it from a more bootstrappy approach, I guess you could say, and actually introduce the form group class, which can be used with either divs or field sets. And so a field set is just a set of fields that belong together, and we're just going to use it to group together, for example, the label and the input control. And inside of the field set, I'm going to set the class equal to form group. So this is the important part here, and we could use this same class in a div if we wanted to instead of using a field set. It's just up to us. You're not going to get anything different. Now we have to apply classes, a class to the label and a different class to the input control. So for labels, there is something called form control label. All right, and we'll always use that. Now, depending on the type of input control, we might choose a different class, but for the most part, we're just going to choose form control. There are specialized ones for like the file, for the range control, and I think that's pretty much it. But there are also special ones for checkboxes and radio buttons. We'll look at those a little bit later, but for the most part, if you're just dealing with simple, like for example, a text box, you would just use the form control class like so. All right, and by making that one tiny change, adding a field set to wrap our fields, adding classes to field set, label, and input, let's just look at the total overall difference that we get between these two. Okay, so you can ignore the H2. I'll strip that out for next iteration of this. But with the just HTML5 with the reboot styling applied, very plain. But now with the Bootstrap 4 styling, you can see that we get a label slightly grayed out. Then we have a nice rounded gray border around our text box. When we put our mouse cursor in, it activates the text box. You can see it changes to a blue outline. Kind of get a blue outline, but it's a different color blue here in the unstyled version. All right, and you'll notice that you get this the label is applied and it has a very specific style and indentation level. So just a little bit nicer, not a dramatic change. But now we can apply these across, for example, all of our field types. So let me, for example, paste in an example of the text area. And so here we have, again, the field set with the most important part, the class equals form group. We could change it to div. It doesn't have to be a field set. Then we're going to use the class equals form label, form control label. And then for the text area itself, I'm using the form control just like we did previously in our text box. And one other thing here, notice that I'm setting the rows, but I'm not setting the columns. That's because if you'll notice with both the input and the text area, they will take up the full width of the container. So in this case, I've got a cell that's 6 columns in width. When you subtract out the padding for the cell, 15 pixels on each side or thereabouts, then you get the full width. So you don't have to specify columns on, for example, a text area. All right, let's continue on. I'm going to paste in a field set for a select dropdown. All right. And many of these I'm just pulling from the HTML5 Elements Bootstrap, and then I just added the form group onto the field set, wrapped it around the whole thing. Here we have our label. Again, nothing different here. We have our class form control label. Then on the select itself, just what you'd expect to see, form control, class applied. Nothing changes with the options. Let's go ahead and run it again. All right, again, a full width select box, and with nothing really different about that either, but it just looks a little bit nicer than the other versions that we have. Okay, all right, so let's get rid of that. All right, now we're going to start getting to some of the parts that might be a little bit different. For example, I'm going to paste in 2 radio buttons. And in this case, instead of using a field set, I'll use div controls, div tags rather, div elements. And so here notice that instead of using the form group class, I'm using the specific radio class for both of my individual radio buttons. Then I have a label control. In between the label controls, opening and closing tags, I have the input of type radio with no special class selected, and then the text for the label itself. All right, so this is a very different style from the others that we've been working with. This is a dramatic change, and you'll see the output looks like that. Okay. Same thing would be true for checkboxes. Instead of using div class equals radio, we'll use div class equals checkbox. Label will still have the form control label, but it's going to wrap around the checkbox itself. So input type equals checkbox, and then the actual text of the label itself. So let's take a look at that. And you can see those options. Now in a moment, we're going to look at an inline version of this, but for right now, that's what we have for our radio buttons and our checkboxes. Okay, and then like I said, there are some special versions of these things. Like for example, here we're back to using a field set. We're back to using the class equals form dash group. And our label, nothing interesting about that. But here we have an input type equals range. And if you'll notice, we have a class. We're not using just form control, but we're using form control range. So a specialized version of that. And the file type also has a different version. I'm not going to demonstrate that though. So this is what the range control looks. Unstyled, where are you here? Come back. Okay. So here's the unstyled Bootstrap version, and then here's the styled Bootstrap version. Very similar, subtle differences, not much. Okay. All right, so if you don't like that style where you have the the label above the given control, you can kind of revert back to having the control on the left or rather the label on the left and controls on the right all kind of align in columns. And you can do that more grid style by using the column classes. So here I'm going to paste in a form in its full glory, and we'll take a look at it. Okay, so here we have, again, this cell is only taking up 6 columns. I'll change that to XS, by the way. And inside of it, there's a form. And inside of the form, there's a series of form groups. Each form group, notice that I have either in the label a column SM2, or here I have a column SM10. All right, as a div tag wrapping around the actual input element. All right, so look how we're able to apply those column classes inside of the label or in a div tag that wraps around our element. So this is going to give us, and I repeat that here for each of these input boxes. So let's go ahead and run it again. And now you can see, well, in this particular case, we don't have as much room as we need for example, the checkbox. So let me back up 1 second here. And let's give it a little more room to breathe and take a look at it then. Because obviously, if we're going to expect it to do that, we need to give it some horizontal space. There we go. Okay, so now you can see how this looks dramatically different with the label on the side rather than on the top. Okay, so that's an option, a styling option for us. And up to now, we've seen everything kind of applied in a vertical format, but we could also create inline forms. So if we just have 1 or 2 fields that we want to display, we can present the information side by side like I did here. In fact, here, let me go back and reformat it just a little bit. We'll go ahead and add some cell, and then I'm going to add some padding, all sides, and we'll just do 1. So now that should look a little bit nicer when we get down there. Yeah, it does. Great. Now, the one thing is that you got to be aware of is whenever you get below the medium size, I believe it is, things will start, you can see we get some wrapping when we get to that medium size and smaller. So I think it's 768 pixels is where they start wrapping things on us. So anyway, okay. So that's an inline form. Very neat. And there's also a version of checkboxes that we can create and radio buttons that are inline as well. And so let me create one of each of those here. I'll paste the first one as a checkbox, and then I'll just use that as a template for the radio inline. Inline radio. All right, and let's take a look at that. All right, so you can see these will line up in line instead of being over each other like before. Okay. All right, there might come a point in time where we need to present information that's static in nature along with our forms. So here's an example of what they're calling static controls, and I'll just paste it in so we can take a quick look at it. So in this case, here we're using the grid style like we looked at earlier. The difference here is notice that inside of this div, we're actually adding a paragraph that has some email address in it. So presumably in this scenario, we've already got some of the data and we just need some different data from the user like their password. So there's a class called form control static that will format any static text to look like it belongs inside of this form. So let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick. So there we go. Okay, and that's the effect that we get. Not a dramatic difference. It'll just put things, make it look like it belongs on the form through padding, through font, and those little tweaks. All right, you can also use classes to control the size of the form fields. We've seen this with buttons and many other things. So here we have a form control LG class to make it large. or a form control SM class to make the control small, and then nothing to leave it at its default size. And so you can see there's the large version of the text box, the default, and then a small version. All controlled by just one class. Great. I also wanted to point this out that if you ever need to like add some little instructions underneath a given, like a text box, for example, you can use the small element from HTML5 and then add like the class text muted, and that will allow you to add a little tag underneath that looks like it belongs there with some additional instructions or an example of the content that belongs in it. So that's a recommendation from their documentation as well. And then the final thing that I want to show you are the, we've used the contextual colors many times for various purposes, but we can use them in our controls as well to give visual input regarding validation. So we might, for example, on a given form group, say we want to show that the input was successful, or there's a warning, or there's danger. So you have these has dash and then the context that we can apply to input controls. And they even work with checkboxes and radio buttons too, and I'll just paste those in below. This is all straight from the documentation. So you can refer to these and you can see examples. All right, so there you go. And you get a little icon as well next to the text. So if you want to warn somebody that the password that they're using is not a secure password, or might want to say, hey, this is the wrong password, you can kind of give that kind of feedback, or you might want to check back with the server to say, hey, this looks fine and nobody's taken this password before, for example. Okay, not sure why you would use it with checkboxes or some of the other controls, but the fact that you can is pretty cool. And just want to see here what other options there are. So here we're using the has success. Let's look at the has. There's danger, feedback, success, and warning. So I guess the one that we haven't seen is the feedback. It might be interesting to see that has feedback. Just out of curiosity, look at that first checkbox. All right, and it's just dark, I guess. Not really sure what the point of that is, but okay. Anyway, so that's all that I really wanted to cover. There's more classes that are available for special situations, and I didn't really want to go into those. But again, your documentation for Bootstrap 4 is always the source of all the little nuanced things that you can do. So, all right, let's continue on the next video. We'll see you there. Thanks.